Hello my friends, and a very warm welcome back to my painting channel. And in this video we are going to be painting a Star Player secret weapon from the Blood Bowl game. This is a Games Workshop and Forge World resin model of Bomber Dribblesnot. So this is one of the new Star Player models that they brought out, and this is going to be a really fun one to paint. So we're going to start by painting some of the more difficult to reach areas first. So we're going to start off with Avalanche Sunset, and we're going to use this to base all of the armor color. So we're going to use this as a really great yellow base, and then we're going to build this up and get some really cool, lovely looking yellow blends out of this. Now I'm starting with the armor, as I said, because some of the armor parts are more difficult to reach. So some of the areas around the chest and the midriff are quite difficult to get your brush into without covering some of the other areas as well. So I'm just using this as a base color first, and I'm just trying to put this one on not being too overly precious over it, just trying to cover all of the armor parts first. And as you can see, I'm just doing across the nose and the goggles and things like that, all in the same color as well. We're then going to move on to use German grey. So this is a really nice dark sort of blue grey colour. This is one of my favourite dark grey colours, and I'm going to use this to paint the bombs, but I'm also going to use this to paint the clothing as well. So Bomber Dribblesnot has a sort of shirt just on his back, and he also has a small pair of shorts. Now I'm painting this instead of a black colour. I mean, you could paint it black if you wanted to, but this one just has that little light blue-grey tinge, which would just kind of draw your eye away from it being a flat black colour or anything like that. But also I'm painting it in this colour so that it doesn't detract from the really vibrant colours that we're going to paint things like the skin and the armour. Once I've painted those areas, I'm just going to use this heavy red. And I'm going to use the heavy red just to paint all of these missiles. So we're just going to take our time now not to get this on any of the yellow and the grey areas that we painted. And this is just, again, just base coat in some of these areas as best we can. As you can see, I've changed my brush now to be a little bit more detailed. So I'm using a little bit of a finer detail brush here. And I'm using a size 0 brush for all of my detailed work. So I get a lot of people asking me what brushes I use. And I tend to use a lot of sort of just cheap synthetic brushes. I find that if a brush breaks, then I'm not wasting a lot of money on them and things like that. Because I tend to do a great deal of painting, I can kind of go through brushes quite quickly. So yeah, just using a size 0 brush for the detailed areas. Now once I've done the missiles and the reds, as you can see, that's a nice dark red. We're then going to move on to use a dark green from AK Interactive, and I'm just going to base coat all of the Greenskin in this colour. And this colour is, as it says on the tin, a nice dark green colour. So all I'm going to do is just paint all of this around the hands, around the skin, around the face and all things like that. Again, I'm using that detailed brush so that I don't get this now on the other areas that we've base coated. So we don't get this on the grey and especially on the yellow. It doesn't matter too much if we do, because we are still just base coating. So if we do make mistakes, it is easy to fix. As you can see, I've just got a little bit on the eyepiece there, just on the goggles. So if we do make mistakes, we can just sort of fix those up nice and quickly and easily. And that's the cool thing about base coating, is you don't need to be too overly precise to begin with, because it is easily repaired. Whereas later, when we're starting to do some of the other layers, we do need to be a lot more careful. So yeah, just trying to cover this all around the mouth, the face, the nose, of course across the head here and things like that. Just trying to make sure that we cover all of this in this nice cool looking dark green colour. Now this green, we're going to build this green up a little bit later, and we're really going to get this green skin to pop. We're going to make these greens really stand out and be one of the main features on the model is looking at sort of like the armour being this bright yellow, and of course the skin being this really nice bright green colour. Being a goblin, you kind of want his skin to be really nice and bright and really pop on the model and really draw your eye to the model. So that's what we're going to do. So from there we're going to move on and use one of my other favourite colours. We're going to use dark rust, and this is a really nice dark brown colour, and I'm just going to paint this across all of the leathers. So starting off with the bags just here, because he has 2 bags over his back with all of the rockets and bombs in, and of course I'm just going to paint the gloves as well. So just being careful again not to get this onto the greens. I'm just trying to take my time just around the fingers, and especially around the chin area and things like that as well. And again, as you can see, just trying to cover as much as I can. I'm also going to paint this across his shoes and these little leather straps holding the armor pads onto his knees as well. And again, don't worry if you make a mistake here or there. As you can see, I'm getting a little bit of brown on that yellow, because you can fix it up before we put the wash on before we put the wash on top. So yeah, it's just painting this across the shoes as well. And once all of that is dried, then I'm going to use a brass scorpion just on the 2 wrist guards, because Bomber Dribblesnot has these 2 little wrist guards. Now you can paint these up silver if you want. I've just opted to go with a cool brass colour because I actually don't want these to stand out too much. I want the main feature to be the skin and the armour, so I'm not going to do a great deal of work on these. I'm actually going to let the wash tone these down and make them look like a little bit of a worn out brass colour. So that's going to suit the model quite nicely, I feel. Again, that's personal choice on your metallics. You can use any metallics you like. If you want to go with a silver, that is absolutely fine. You can also, if you wanted to, use this colour to paint on the spikes just up on the shoulder pad, which I'm keeping in yellow. And then one of the smaller details, we're just going to use bone white here, which is a nice creamy colour. And we're just going to paint the teeth, and of course we're also going to paint all of the nails and the claws. But I'm also going to paint all of these little fuse wires, or all these little fuses on the bombs. So I'm going to use this bone white to paint all of these little fuses and things like that. The nails, as I say, the teeth, and just a few things like that. Just going to try to paint all of these in the same sort of colour and in the same sort of tone. And I'm also going to paint these little stitches just across the bag as well, so you can see there's a few little stitches just holding areas of the bag together. And from there I'm just using a small bit of orange fire from Bellow just to paint this little bit of the fuse, because as you can see the bomb that he's got in his hand has a lit fuse on there. So we're not going to paint this up too much like a proper flame with flaming colours, just going to keep it toned down a little bit just because it's kind of like a spark from the fuse. Once all your base coats are done, we're going to look a little something like this, and then I'm going to move on to doing one of my favourite things, and that is applying a wash. So I'm using Agrax's shade from Games Workshop, and I'm applying this onto the miniature. And what I'm going to try to do, as you can see just there across the eye and of course the mouth, is I'm going to try to stop this from pooling too much in areas where it's really going to tone things down. So I'm just going to put a bit of this onto the miniature, and then I'm going to use my brush to manipulate and move this around so that it doesn't pool too much in certain areas. If you allow this to pool too much, you can in turn take away some of the details, and that is the last thing we want to do. We don't want to take those details away, and we don't want to darken everything down really nastily. We just want to apply this across the model so that it sits in the recesses and ties those colours together. That's why I'm using just the one wash, because it's going to tie all of those colours into one. Now once that's done, I'm going to then move on to starting with the skin, and we're going to build this skin up, and as I said earlier, we're really going to make this skin pop. So we're going to go with the original colour to begin with, and we're going to use this dark green colour, and I'm just going to use this to paint across all of the areas of the skin, but just avoiding where that shade has sat in the recess points. So just where that shade has sat, like in between the folds of his cheeks and around his lips and chin, and as you can see in between the fingers and things like that. So we're building that colour back up, but avoiding those recessed areas where the shade is going to create that deeper, darker colour. Now we're going to mix then deep green and dark green together, and I'm using these at half and half, so that's one droplet of each. And what we're doing is we're just going to go up in these half stops. So we've used the base coat, and now we're doing a half stop in between this and the next colour. And what that means is I'm using half of the base colour and half of the highlight, just to create a in-between colour before using the highlight. And the reason why I'm doing this is because this is going to allow the colour to blend and transition much smoother on the model, rather than just placing a highlight and it being too extreme and too over the top for what we're doing. So as I said, this is using one blob each of the paint, so 50% each, so 50-50 as I like to call it. And then as you can see, using a nice thin down paint, I'm just using a dabbing motion to place this across the raised areas. Now that we've used the half stop, we're going to go with the straight highlight. So we're going to use the deep green on its own. And I'm doing exactly the same thing. So I'm just using a nice thin down paint and a nice dabbing motion on the raised areas, as you can see, and this is just creating the extra step of highlight. Now because we've used that 50-50 in between, that's creating a nice smooth transition to this highlight. And of course as well, because this paint is nice and thin, that's also going to dry down and create this really nice transition, this smooth transition into the highlighting. Because if you don't smooth your paints and you just apply big blobs of paint on your model, sometimes it can be too garish and too extreme. So moving on to the next highlight, we're going to use that deep green and a light green. And again, we're doing the exact same thing. So we're using 50-50, so a blob of each. And again, this is creating that next half step up. So before we go directly to that light green, we're just using this to be very, very, very pinpoint in where we are highlighting. And just using a detail brush, as you can see, I'm just picking out some of the very, very tips of those fingers, just around the face, you know, around all of the nose area. I'm just trying to pick out as much detail on the model as I can with these highlights. So we've gone from the base coat, then into a half stop, then into the first highlight, then a half stop, then the second highlight. And this is how we're building this skin tone. This is how we're getting this skin tone to really, really, really pop. And once all of the skin is dry, we're going to move on to the leathers. And now I'm using the AK Interactive Leather Brown, and if you've seen me painting leathers before, you'll kind of know the effect and the setup that I'm painting here. And pretty much that's all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use this leather brown. Again, nice thin down paints, as you can see. It's moving and manipulating onto the miniature really, really nicely. And this is allowing me to get creative with some of the brush strokes and things like that. And that's all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to fill in and paint this on top of the dark rust color that we used as a base. But what I'm doing here is again leaving a lot of the shade in those recess points. So I'm using the shade as some of the sort of like darker folds and creases and things like that in the bags as well. And as you can see, I'm just using the very tip of the brush, just trying to manipulate the paint around the model as much as possible. And the cool thing with this is it is going to dry down in a nice smooth transition. So this is going to create a nice first step sort of highlight to the bags. And again, we're going to do the same thing as what we did with the skin to make this pop and really build these colors up. So far, that's all we're doing is just using this leather brown, and as you can see, going across those gloves as well, across those finger points, and across all of the folds in the bags. And again, if you've seen me do the leather before, you'll know then that the next step is using a deep brown and a leather brown. So that's just using a nice half stop up, just the same as we did with the skin. And then again, as you can see, moving on to a slightly more detailed brush, so back to my size 0 brush. And then we're just going to really pick out these folds. As you can see, there's a lot of creases just around the side here, where the bag is sort of, the weight of those bombs in the bag is just holding the bag down and creating these creases. And as you can see straight away now, you can see these highlights already starting to show through on that bag, really starting to make this leather color sort of pop, really bringing the bags to life. And so as you can see, I'm not too worried about brush strokes and things like that, especially with leathers, because you kind of want things to be a little bit scratchy and a little bit scraped and rough, because, you know, leathers and things like that, and bags and canvases and things, they kind of have textures of their own. You don't want them to be too smooth, otherwise it will look a little bit too unrealistic then. As you can see, I'm just picking out as much detail as I can, not trying to be overly precious on the brush strokes, and again just using sort of a mixture of dabbing motions and scratchy motions and things like that, just to build up this color transition on the bags. And the cool thing is the underneath and things, you can leave all that as dark as you like. You can leave that nice and dark like the base coat, because that's going to add to the shadows and add to the depth of the model a little bit later as well, and that's fantastic. That's kind of the effect that we're looking for. And again, you can use this just across the fingers here, across the gloves, and then you can just be very careful as to where you're picking out where your highlights are. So as you can see, I'm highlighting one side of the glove, one side of those fingers, but not the underside. I'm leaving the underside darker, so again that creates that element of lighter coming from the top and darker from underneath, making it, giving it more depth. So once we've done that half stop, we're then going to go straight to deep brown, and we're going to do the exact same thing again, using those really nice thin down paints and a cool size 0 paintbrush. We're just going to go back in and pick out those folds and those creases. And as you can see, I'm just picking out as many of those creases as I can, trying to be a little bit more specific as to where I paint these highlights now, because we kind of want this to pop on those creases rather than the whole bag. So as you can see, that color now is already starting to show through, and we're kind of getting a lot more depth out of those leathers. And it's a really simple effect, but a really, really cool looking effect as well. Now I'm opting to paint these in sort of like an orangey leather kind of effect, because there's a few different ways you can go with leathers. There's a few different colors and a few different color tones and options you can go. And when I paint leathers, I tend to paint them slightly more sort of orangey or reddy in color, but that's just personal choice. And as you can see now, that orange sort of leathery kind of effect is really starting to pop through, really starting to show through. I mean, we're only on to what, third layer now here, and it's starting to show really cool on the model. We're starting to get some really vibrant sort of tones and colors here. Again, doing the same thing with the glove, just picking where I place the paint, so just making sure that the paint is sitting just on the top areas here and leaving some of the darker area underneath. Now from there, because I'm opting for a slightly more orange colour with my leathers, I'm just going to move on to this really sort of bright orange colour from AK. And what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to be very specific. So this time I'm using a very detailed brush. So this is a 5.0, so this is a very small detail brush. I'm just using the very tip of the brush just to run this across all of the edges. So I'm just picking out some of the edges. But again, a lot of this is dabbing motion. I'm not trying to get too many sort of like brush strokes and things like that. A lot of this is dabbing motion to create that texture and that effect, but I'm also then just using this to scrape a few sort of like scratches and scrapes and marks across the bag. So as you can see, I'm just dragging some of this paint across just like so. Very fine little details, very fine little scratches and effects across the bag. It's going to add so much more to the texture and depth and the character of the model and these bags as well. It's going to make them look a lot more sort of rustic and beaten and worn, and that's kind of the effect we're looking for. So as you can see, just build in some of those scrapes here. Now once we've done the bag, so that's the skin done and the bag done, we're going to move on and continue with the armour. So we're going back to that Avalanche Sunset, and we're just going to build this bag up first before we go on to using some of our highlights. So we're just using this Avalanche Sunset, as I say, just to build this colour back up. And we're going to be careful not to get this on the areas that the shade is sat in, so in those recessed areas, especially around some of these little rivets on the armour, and of course just in the corners where the paint, as you can see, the shade is just sat nicely into the corners there, creating that element of depth that we want. Now, as I said, I'm thinning my paints down just with a little bit of water or a little bit of flow improver, and I'm making sure that these are nice and thin. So this is going to take me about 2 or 3 layers of each colour to get to the vibrancy that I want. And that's just purely because I'm mixing and blending these colours together to kind of get this really cool, great, vibrant, blended colour tone. Yellows as well are normally quite thin, so as you build these tones up, they do tend to take a couple of different colours, or a couple of different coats rather, to build that vibrancy, but that's fine. Just a little bit of patience and keep on building your way through it. The reward at the end is worth all of that detail and all of that time that you spend building these layers. So as you can see, I'm going back across the same shoulder pad with the same colour at the moment, just trying to build that vibrancy up. Now once the base coat of Avalanche Sunset has dried, I am then going to use the mixture between the Avalanche Sunset and a nice deep yellow from Vallejo, and I'm moving on to one of my more sort of rough-edged brushes, and I'm using a stippling motion because this is going to be my first highlight. And again, because I want the armors to look a little bit more worn and a little bit more battered, just kind of creating texture even though there is no texture. With this nice thin down paint, that's all I'm doing is using the tip of the brush. Although all of the bristles are a little bit rough and ready, I'm using the tip of the brush just to dab this in place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick areas where I want this to be. So I'm going to dab this in more the middle of the shoulder pads while leaving the darker yellow around the edges. And this is going to allow me to build a more bright, vibrant sort of tone through the center of the armor, which is going to create that awesome transition that we can see in the photos. So doing the same thing again, we're just going to use the deep yellow on its own now. So whereas we've done the first half stop transition, we're going to do the same thing now, but just with the deep yellow. So again, I'm just being specific about where I'm placing this. I'm not covering the whole shoulder pad, I'm just covering sort of the middle section. So again, that transition and that blend is going to be smoother so that the middle is brighter and the edges are darker, and that's going to create a lot more of a cool blend that will draw your eye to the model. We kind of want this model to be a real big focus point sort of on the game or on your shelf when you're displaying it. We really want this yellow to pop, so we're going to spend a bit of time building these layers up. Again, I'm using that stippling motion, so again, I'm not being overly precious on my brush strokes. I'm just using the tip of the brush and just dabbing it as quickly as I can. And I'm dabbing this just so that it creates that texture and tone again. Again, using a mixture of different colours. We're going to use that deep yellow, but we're also going to mix pastel yellow into this. And again, this is a half and half, so this is my 50-50. With this being a nice thin down paint, we're also then just going to use that dabbing motion, as you can see here, and this is going to build up that colour. Now what I'm also going to do is, while the paint is wet, I am going to take the paint off the brush, and I'm going to do something called a wet blending. And just using a damp brush, you can see, I was just pulling some of that paint across the model. And that's all I'm doing with that, is by adding a little bit of water to it. Now you don't want too much water, but just add in a little bit of damp. Using the damp brush, you can pull and manipulate the paint across certain areas of the model, and that will give you a nice smooth transition as well. I'll make a video on how to do a lot of sort of wet blending another time, just to give you guys a better idea. But pretty much that's all I'm doing, is I'm dotting on some thin down paint with one brush, and then just using a damp brush, not a wet brush, a damp brush, just to pull and manipulate some of that paint down the model, so it creates the highlight and creates that transition and smooths that transition out quite nicely. It's the same sort of effect that I've used on my non-metallic metals on my Fellowship of the Ring set. So if you are new to the channel and you want me to see how to do that sort of thing, check out the Fellowship of the Ring set, especially the Boromir video, where I go into detail on the non-metallic metal effect that I've used. But again, you can see I'm just using that wet blend there, just placed the paint and then just using the brush to pull out some of the edges. And once that's dry, so all of those colours and all of those wet layers have sort of dried down a little, I'm just going to go back to that pastel yellow and using my extreme sort of, my extreme detail brush, so my 5.0, my very thin detail brush, as you can see. I'm just going to use this now to create scrapes and scratches and go across the edges of the armor and just really make this armor pop just around these edges, just to, again, using that dabbing motion and things like that, leaving certain gaps and things so that it looks a little bit scraped, a little bit worn, a little bit beaten and things like that. Again, adding to that texture, that tone, that character, and the sort of rough nature that is Blood Bowl. So as you can see, I've done that just on the shoulder pad, but I'm also going to do a little bit just around the nose piece here, just to give you an idea as to how I'm stretching and scraping those sorts of colours out. This pastel yellow is a fantastic colour for this, because it is a very light sort of white yellow colour, and the AK Interactive paints actually dry down to a really nice matte effect, so you can thin them down loads and loads, and then they make just that really subtle difference to your model when they dry. Just creates that little bit of a like I say, that perfect edge highlight, especially on this type of model. I'm also just going to create a few scratches and scrapes just across the nose piece, and just picking out some of the rivets again, and again just going across the front area of the goggles, just so that it looks like the paint and things is scratching off these, or they're a little bit worn out and battered and bruised and beaten. So we're going to move back onto the missiles and onto the rockets. The only thing that I haven't done with the rockets is I wasn't quite brave enough to paint them with the spirally sort of white and red mixed colours. So I'm just going back and I'm going to paint these red. I'm going to kind of have a little bit of a cop-out. I'm going to be a little bit safe today, and I'm just going to paint them just red. So I'm going back to that heavy red, and again just using that stippling, that dabbing motion with my sort of stippling brush. I'm just going to add and apply this paint onto the model and into that area. Now once I've done the rockets, I'm also going to move back to the detail brush, just so that I can pick out all of these little sticks of dynamite and all of these little bombs and things that he's got in his bag. That's about all we're going to do for the bombs, is we're just going to build these up in red. Like I said, I wasn't kind of brave enough to go for doing multiple colors, and I've seen people do like spirals where they're like half red, half white, and they are fantastic. And if you're brave enough, go for it, because those things look amazing. I just went a little bit safe, because this model is actually something that I'm painting for a friend, so I didn't kind of want to go too extreme and maybe mess anything up. I was a little bit scared, I'll be honest. So we're going to move on and use a highlight of Mephiston Red from Citadel as well. I'm doing the same thing, as you can see, just nice thin down paint and the dabbing stippling motion at first on the top areas, while I then switch back to my detail brush just to pick out some of the highlights and the colours on all of these little dynamite sticks and explosives and whatever other bits of TNT and bombs this guy has got in his bag. So just being careful here not to get this onto all of the greys. There we go, you can see with this nice thin paint it's starting to make these rockets pop. I'm going to move on to one of my favourite colours, partly because it's called Bloody Red and partly because it is a nice vibrant red. Again, just using this just to stipple and build a little bit of a highlight because this is a nice vibrant red, so this one's really going to pop on top of those rockets. And I'm going to pick out some of the more detailed areas, so some of the very edges of the dynamite now. And again, I'm just using that very fine 5.0, very, very fine detailed brush just to pick out as much of the detail as I can. And again, that stippling motion is going to create that element of texture and things like that. I mean, you can add scratches and scrapes and things like that with a highlighted colour, or maybe like a pink or a purple or something like that if you like. That is completely up to you. So we're going to move on to doing the bombs, and I'm going to use a Necro Grey from scale 75, and this is a cool sort of dark grey colour. Again, this is quite a blue grey, but the scale 75 colour I find has a little bit more of a blue vibrancy to it than the German grey that I used as the base, so this makes it the perfect colour to start with your highlights. I also find with the scale 75 paints, they are fantastic to water down. They are really, really good paints in terms of they thin down and they manipulate onto the miniature in a really, really cool way. Very, very nice paints to use in that sense. So if you don't have any scale 75 paints, give them a shot because they're really cool paints. And that's all I'm doing, as you can see, is just building up some of that colour and tone onto these bombs. So using that lighter blue grey, that's all we're doing, is just picking out some of the highlights and some of the details and those bombs. Of course, with the trousers and the shirt as well, we're going to do the same thing. And the cool thing is, again, the darker side to the bomb is closer to the goblin, so we only need to paint really sort of the one side to get that sort of bluish grey colour popping on the one side, which again will draw your eye into the model and make him look a little bit more unique as well. Once that's done, I'm going to use Huldra Blue from scale 75, and as I said, the cool thing with these paints is they water down really well. So I've added quite a lot of water to this to turn this into a glaze, and I'm adding this on top, kind of like I did if you watched my video when I painted Chief Brian Irons from the Resident Evil 2 board game. I used this colour as a glaze on top of grey just to create this sort of like vibrant blue boost, and that's kind of all we're doing here. I'm not going to paint over all of the bombs, and I'm not going to paint the whole bombs, but this is just giving some of the bombs a lighter sort of blue tone in the light. Again, drawing your eye to that model so it doesn't look like a flat black colour or a flat grey colour. It's just adding that little bit of colour to it. It's also cool as well because the blues are going to be really toned down and really sort of cool and cold, and against all of those bright yellows and vibrant greens, it's going to have that really cool transition that is going to make that bomb stand out. And we're going to move back to the bone white, and we're going to paint these fuses. And as you can see, all I'm doing with this is I'm using the very tip of that brush again, that 0.5, and I'm just using the very tip of the brush to create these little sort of bumps in the fuse so that it looks like the fuse isn't one flat colour. So it's kind of creating that element that the fuse has a texture to it. Very, very simple technique. As you can see, just using the tip of the brush here, very, very, very simple technique, but makes a massive difference to the finished piece, makes those fuses really, really, really stand out, and it makes it look like you've spent a lot of time painting each individual strand of the fuses, and it creates a really, really cool effect. So again, just using that very tip of the brush, as you can see, and trying to be as careful as possible not to get this onto the bombs. Just there you go, just using the very, very tip of the brush, just creating that element and that texture of these fuses being sort of wrapped up and wired up and things like that. We're also going to paint the little sort of stitches in the bag as well, as you can see. Now what I've purposefully done with the bag as well, if you've noticed, is I've left the base colour on the areas that have been stitched on, so it makes the bag have a little bit of a two-tone effect, so that it has a darker patch almost sewn on where there was a hole. And you could paint that any other leather colour that you like, but I've just chosen to leave it the base colour. Now, as I said, with the fuse, we're going to paint this up with a cool bright sort of fuse colour, so we're using that orange colour again. I'm just going to go on here and paint the orange around. Then we're going to use a bright orange, which is a lighter, more sort of pastel-y orange, and I'm going to be a little bit more specific with this, sort of going from about halfway down towards the fuse, just to kind of show a little bit more brightness towards the very edge of the fuse, where it's burning brighter just at the tip of the fuse there. And then just to add to that little bit of brightness as well, I'm going to add a small dab of Avalanche Sunset just down towards the tip of the fuse again, just to kind of create that sort of that kind of spark effect. So we're not going for an all-out flame or an all-out fire effect, because this little bit of flame is too small anyway. It's just creating this little bit of a spark and this little bit of a colour and texture just here. There we go. And that's giving us a really cool little effect. Now if you wanted to, and you wanted to go for like an OCL, you could always dry brush a little orange around, but again, I haven't done that. I went a little bit safe and just kept it one flat colour. From there, I'm just going to use a small amount of flat earth, and I'm just going to pick out the details on his shoes. And we're just going to go around the lip of the shoes and around the back area of the shoes as well, just to bring these a little bit back to life, because they've kind of been toned down quite a bit down here on the base. So where all of the shade and things like that have just left, it's just left him a little bit dark down the bottom. So I'm using this flat earth colour just to pick out a little bit more colour and a little bit more texture on those shoes, and just give him a little bit more character just down and around the bottom. Now from there, I'm using a colour called Ocean Blue, and again I'm going to really sort of glaze this down and use a great amount of water. So I'm using a lot of water. You can see just how thin the paint is by the way that I'm dabbing this. And again, I'm just adding this a little bit onto those bombs, but this time I'm just putting this onto the very top. Now this is an optional stage. You don't have to follow this bit if you don't want to. This is just something that I wanted to do, again, just to kind of make that colour pop and give the cool sort of cold colour texture to the bomb, especially against those bright sort of greens and yellows and things like that, just to give that transition and create a little bit more of a character towards it. From there as well, we can also use a graphite, so like we've done with the armor, and of course on the leathers, we're just going to use the very fine detail brush, again that 5.0, and I'm just going to drag some really thin sort of scrapes and some really thin sort of almost cartoon looking scratches onto the bombs. But again, it's just about kind of creating a little bit more texture and give you something else to look at, because if these bombs are one flat color, you might not sort of get as much out of them. So by creating this sort of element of scratches, scrapes, little bit of blue, little bit of grey, kind of makes them pop a little bit, and it makes for a fun way of showing off a cool fun part of the miniature, because the bombs is one of the coolest, more fun parts of the model as well. So yeah, just using this, especially around those edges, as you can see where the fuses are, just to create these scrapes and sort of mixed textures and tones. And again, like I say, it's just making it pop and giving you something to look at. So yeah, just around the edges here where the fuse is. You can see that texture on the fuse looks fantastic now. Absolutely, really does make the model pop. So I'm just going to quickly use a dirty red, and again, this is a completely optional stage, but on a lot of the videos, on a lot of the photos rather that I've seen, and a lot of the images that I've seen, and the stock art for this guy, he likes to have a hand-painted message on his bombs. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to write the word bomb on his bomb, because what says bomb more than bomb? I'm challenging myself to see how many times I can say bomb in this video. So you can make a drinking game out of it. So pretty much that's all I'm doing, is just hand scratching the word bomb here, and I'm trying to make this as crude as possible to make it look a lot more like a goblin, and a lot more sort of like this crude handwritten this crude sort of handwritten message across the bomb. The cool thing is I'm left-handed, so I'm not particularly great at writing anyway, so it's going to make it look a lot more crude and a lot more like goblin handwriting, purely just because that's how I write. So yeah, so this is what we're going to do. We're just going to use that dirty red as the base, which is going to tone down and create a nice dark colour. And from there then we're going to put the bloody red, again one of my favourites because of the name, just across the top to make it really pop and really bring that writing out, so that the message shines through that he's got a bomb in his hand. Plain and simple. As you can see, I'm trying to make sure that everything's nice and square. Again, making it look a lot more crude, so that it's not this overly well written, you know, he's not the smartest goblin there, but man, he can throw a bomb, you know what I mean? He's in the team for one job, and that is to throw a bomb. So yeah, So yeah, as you can see, I've had a lot of fun with this one. I've had a lot of fun painting this one, but I've also had a lot of fun talking through this one as well. And all in all, that is Bomber painted and done. I really enjoyed it. I've had a lot of fun, I'm not going to lie. It was a really good model to paint. I hope you guys really enjoyed this one, and I hope that some of the little techniques, the scratches, the scrapes, and all these different things have shown through. I really hope that you enjoyed it. As always though, thank you so much for all your support, the kind words, the watching, the comments. I mean, I'm nearly up to 1,000 subscribers now, which is something that I never thought would happen, and that is all thanks to you guys and your input and everything that you give to the channel as well, because the more input you give, the more I want to paint. So thank you all so much for your kindness, and hopefully I will see you guys on the next one. Take care, my friends.